workshop. Obviously, by the ocean economy team. Right, theme for today. This third session, innovation to support efficient maritime spatial planning. And what we're going to try to do here is to look at three areas, three issue areas. First of all, what sort of progress have we been making in recent years in marine spatial planning, and how do we see marine spatial planning evolving in the next few years? We have a second area where we're looking at how science and technology can support marine spatial planning in the coming years. And then we have a third presentation on what you might call major data gaps and how those data gaps can best be filled. We've got three very distinguished speakers to help us address these questions. We have Charles Taylor from the IOC in Paris, who's been working for many years, I think, on these questions of marine spatial planning. We have Federico Guerrero from the Italian National Research Council with us, and finally we have Anton Dohrn from the Henry Line Galway Island, who is speaking to the third island. Just a quick word on timing. I think there's an awful lot to be said on these matters, and so what we'll do, I'm going to ask the speakers to aim for a presentation of about 15 minutes, but then to leave plenty of time for questions and for discussion with the so as we approach the end of the 15 minutes, I'll sort of start to make appropriate signals and waving and so on, just so that you know that the time is running. So, okay, and that's, we will start with the first presentation from Charles Taylor. So, the floor is yours.
Right. Okay, working? Working? Fine, thank you. Let me just say a few more words about who I am. Number one, I'm an American, so I speak loudly. I hope you can hear me. Number two, I live in Paris, so I'm an American in Paris and enjoying it a great deal. I've lived there for the last 12 years working for UNESCO's Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, and my sole purpose in working at the IOC has been to develop a program in marine spatial planning, or maritime spatial planning, as you like to call it in Europe. It's the only place that calls it maritime spatial planning, but c'est la vie. I put this slide up first because I've very much enjoyed coming to Naples. I was here 50 years ago. It's changed a little bit. Not too much, but it's changed a little bit, and it seems to be changing quite a bit under the surface. But I did have the opportunity to go to Pompeii, and I think most of you are probably Italian and probably from Naples, so you know about all of these kinds of things. But if you haven't been to Pompeii, I highly recommend it. And this is a mosaic that doesn't appear in Pompeii, in the ruins, but it did appear there a long time ago, and it was brought to the Archaeological Museum here in Naples. I think it's just emblematic of what the marine environment was like in 200 BC and afterward for quite a while, I imagine. But the abundance and the diversity of marine life at that time must have been fantastic, and I'm sure the Gulf of Naples doesn't look like this today. Too bad. So I'm going to talk about marine or maritime spatial planning. I'll use marine because it's sort of the global title of the topic, but Europe is by far ahead in terms of a region, and I'll point that out in a few seconds. I want to talk about where it's come from in a very short period of time, because marine spatial planning wasn't even mentioned before 2005. I mean, nobody knew what it meant. Nobody really used that term. It's not a new idea. Okay, we've been talking about integrated management, ocean management, integrated coastal and ocean management for a long time. In fact, I've been going to ocean governance meetings for well over 30 years. And we always talk about the same thing and come back the next year and talk about the same thing and come back 3 years later and talk about the same thing. But nobody talks about how do you actually do integrated ocean management or maritime spatial planning. And that's going to be the focus of my talk. But again, the need for more integrated management is not a new idea. It goes back to some of the early days of the law of the sea negotiations and has been a continuing topic, or at least a recommendation or an action that comes out of most international meetings. We need more integration, okay? But it never happens. This is sort of the context of where we are, where we were in 2005, and to a certain extent where we still are 20 years later, 15 years later. And that is that the way we deal with human activities in the ocean is on a first-come, first-served basis. Okay? 100 years ago, there weren't many problems in terms of conflicts among uses. We used the sea for fishing, we used the sea for exploration, and we used the sea primarily for military purposes. So there wasn't a lot of interaction among those different uses, and there was not much of a problem. Over the last 100 years, particularly as the sea becomes more industrialized, we still manage the sea on a sector-by-sector basis. That means that we manage marine transportation, and we do a fairly good job on marine transportation. Or we manage fisheries, and we do sometimes a good job on managing fisheries. Or we manage the environment, the marine environment, but all on a sector, a siloed kind of basis, with not a whole lot of integration across these different sectors. And as the sea becomes busier, and it certainly has become busy over the last 20 years, conflicts among the uses, these new uses, particularly wind, aquaculture, tourism, more and more oil and gas development, wind energy, etc. As these uses expand, conflicts among the uses are inevitable. And not only is it conflicts among uses, but it's also conflicts between users and the marine environment. Okay? We have a degraded marine environment, oftentimes because of expanded human uses in the ocean. This is a quote from an article that appeared in The Economist just a few months ago, in August, and it points out the fact that maritime industry, particularly maritime technologies, are advancing much faster. We know how to build better structures offshore in some ways than we do on land. So this is not going to go away, it's going to continue to expand. This is sort of the economic rationale for maritime or marine spatial planning. Okay. Demand for goods and services. People have been talking about goods and services this morning. Food, energy, minerals, etc. often exceeds the capacity of the marine environment to meet the demand in a particular place simultaneously. Okay? We need some way to sort of sort out what's more or less important. In many cases, particularly in the marine environment, users have free access to resources. And I think, again, if there are economists in the room, you know the problem with free access to resources. We get overuse, conflicts, etc. And eventually, the resources begin to degrade. Lots of the things that we've been talking about, ecosystem goods and services, for example, are not priced. Okay? We don't know how to put a value on many of these ecosystem goods and services. So the way we deal with them is to ignore them in most economic studies and benefit cost analyses. We just simply don't put a price on a lot of these things. And we talk about all of the goods and services that the market economy produces, but we forget there's also a non-market economy out there that also delivers goods and services. We just don't know much about it, and we certainly don't price it. So when it comes to making trade-offs among these different uses, how do we do that? Economists would say, well, let the market take care of it. But if we don't have prices on a lot of these goods and services, it's not going to come out with a very effective or efficient set of outcomes. So we need a public process that can identify what we already have, where we want to go, and how are we going to get there. And that public process is called marine or maritime spatial planning, at least in my book. Unfortunately, we don't have this guy out there, right? There's no Neptune, there's no Poseidon out there to balance all of these kinds of things. We do need something that is more of a political process. And this is why we defined marine or maritime spatial planning back at a meeting held in 2006. About 50 marine planners and scientists got together at UNESCO, and we talked about how to make a field or a profession out of all of this nascent, the ideas that were sort of bubbling around on how better to manage the ocean. Not just to talk about it, but how do we actually develop a process that can be used to make the kinds of decisions that we've been talking about but avoiding. So this is the definition that has sort of stuck, and just a few of the key parts of that definition. It's a public process. It's not private, okay? This is not something that should be done in boardrooms, although certainly decisions are taken in boardrooms, but it's a public process that should be transparent. It's about analyzing and allocating human activities in space and time. It would be good to call it marine spatial and temporal planning, but that gets a little awkward. And we want to achieve some kind of balance among the different kinds of goals and objectives that people have for a particular region. And those goals and objectives include environmental or ecological, economic, social, cultural. There are a lot of different kinds of goals and objectives that come up when people sit around the table and they say, well, this is what I would like our marine region to be at some point. It's important that many of these goals and objectives eventually are defined through a political process. So again, it's not just economics that should decide these kinds of things, but it's a broader political kind of process, a public process that marine or maritime spatial planning is all about. You'll find this definition pretty much in every plan that's being developed. These are some of the characteristics that we have of what marine spatial planning should be. And when someone asks me, is this a good plan, I usually use this list to say, well, if it addresses these kinds of characteristics or has those characteristics, then it could be a reasonable plan over time. Place-based is pretty obvious, right? We want to talk about places in the ocean that people can identify with. When you talk about the degradation of the ocean, that just goes over the head of almost everyone, right? They just can't get their arm or their head around the idea of the entire ocean, the world ocean, even the Atlantic, even the Mediterranean. So we really try to think about planning at least within the exclusive economic zones of different countries. That has been sort of the boundaries of maritime spatial planning that the EU and we at UNESCO have been advocating as well. Participatory, I don't think I have to explain that either. It varies from place to place, but participation and transparency is very important. It's multi-objective and integrated. It is not just marine conservation. We're not talking about a process that develops marine protected areas only, right? MPAs might be part of the regional plan, but it is not just a marine conservation program. It is not just an economic development program either, although marine spatial planning, again, can be used for economic development. It's a balance among all of these different kinds of goals and objectives. It's future-oriented. That should go without saying, right? I mean, that's the whole purpose of planning. Planning is not about what has happened. It's not about where we are. We can't do very much about those kinds of things, but we can do things about the future. And when we say it's planning and planning is future-oriented, we're talking about what do we do today or in the short run that can achieve where we want to be 10 or 20 years from now. So that's what marine planning is all about. Ecosystem-based goes without saying as well. These are contemporary plans, and everybody says they're doing ecosystem-based planning and management. It's very difficult to evaluate that because we're not quite sure what ecosystem-based planning and management really is. We don't have a prescription, we don't have a book on how to do ecosystem-based management. We're still struggling with that idea. But marine spatial planning can come close to doing that. Continuing and adaptive. I was trained as a planner. In fact, I started out as an architect. So I know about master plans. And I still see people saying, oh yes, I understand what marine planning is all about. It's developing a master plan for the ocean. But how do you develop a master plan when there is so much uncertainty with respect to where we are, what kind of information we have? We have to do something that is adaptive. So we plan for recurring periods of planning. And in order to do that, we need monitoring and evaluation so we can determine what's working and what's not working. But it is important to have a monitoring and evaluation component in marine planning. And then finally, government-led. The government, this is a public resource we're talking about. Many governments don't accept that. They've never thought about it before. But the EEZ, the marine area out to 200 nautical miles or less in some cases, but that area is a public resource. Again, it doesn't belong to the private sector. It doesn't belong to fishermen, per se. People claim those kinds of rights, but in fact it's a public resource, and the government is responsible for managing that resource. So we've got to get governments recognizing that they're responsible for doing this. These are the EEZs of the world, about 40% of the ocean, 140,000 or 140 million square kilometers. And I'll tell you how much of that is already under plans in a minute. This is what a regional distribution of planning efforts look like. There are about 65 countries engaged in marine spatial planning. Okay? There are only 23 in Europe, so we're counting many of those 23 as participants, but there's a lot of work going on outside of Europe, in North America, in Asia. China has a reasonably sophisticated marine management program. In fact, it's a lot more sophisticated from the standpoint of user charges and charging people for using a public resource, charging industry primarily for using a public resource, and using some portion of that money to support ongoing management, monitoring, evaluation kinds of programs. So China is very much an important place to look when it comes to good practices. But Europe is almost half of the existing activities. Okay? Now, this is not just a list of countries, these are initiatives. So many countries have multiple regions. That's why the numbers don't quite add up if you're looking and trying to figure out how 23 countries can be 50% of the whole topic. Germany has 2 plans. England has, I think, 9 planning regions. Places like that add up to, again, the 65 initiatives that I'm talking about. And many of these plans that are existing in the world have already been approved. Okay, so we have initiatives that already are approved and being implemented. Many of them are still in the very beginning process. A little over a third are still just getting started. That means getting authority through legislation, getting financing, and beginning a planning process, again, to make decisions about the future of these regions. Not all of them cover the entire exclusive economic zone. About half do. About another little over a third only cover the territorial sea. Okay. Territorial sea is out to 12 nautical miles, so it's a lot smaller area for planning. And even a few of them only exist at the municipal or local level. Big question is, should plans be enforceable? And the usual response is, of course they should be enforceable, or they don't mean anything. Well, yeah, that's true, and many of them, particularly in the United States, all of our coastal management plans and all of our exclusive economic zone plans, there's only 2 of them that are existing, are in fact regulatory plans. It's a little unusual. Not all of them are. Only about 40% are regulatory, and most of them are advisory. But that doesn't mean they're completely toothless, because many of the plans are going to have management actions within the plans that are carried out by different agencies, and those agencies will have regulatory responsibility. So the idea is that we want to make sure that the management plan that is developed from marine spatial planning is in fact enforceable in some way, either directly by a single organization, the planning organization, not usual, or agencies that are within the plan that have cooperated to put their management authorities in place within an overall spatial plan. It's another topic that everybody says, well, it's important that we consider land-sea interactions in marine planning. And that's certainly important. But we don't do a great job on doing that. About half of them actually consider land-sea interactions. In Germany, for example, the authority to do marine planning lies both at the national level and at the state level, the Länder in Germany. Right? The Lander has jurisdiction out to 12 nautical miles, so they are definitely doing integrated planning when they do their plans. They do terrestrial and they do marine planning out to 12 nautical miles. The federal government does the rest of the area. There are other examples of where that takes place, but not many, not enough. And in fact, many marine plans start offshore. They say, we will not do anything within 3 nautical miles or 1 nautical mile or somewhere, and that's where we're going to start, and we'll go out to 200 nautical miles. So there's no one definition of what the marine boundaries are, but this is an issue that's important when we draw those boundaries, that we make sure that we are trying to incorporate not only what's going on in terms of the sea affecting the land, but also the land affecting the sea. Get those interactions within the plan. This is about where we're going. Okay. I mentioned very quickly that in 2006, when we had our first international workshop on marine spatial planning, there were less than 10 people, or less than 10 countries that were engaged in maritime planning activities. 5 of them had a plan that existed. The Great Barrier Reef, for example, everybody knows the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. It's in a lot of trouble now because of climate change, but a long time ago, when it was just getting started in 1978, the Great Barrier Reef hired land use planners to actually zone the Great Barrier Reef. And they zoned no-go areas, they zoned multiple use areas, they zoned various kinds of places within a very large area for different kinds of uses. So that was probably one of the first really practical applications of marine planning, and it has been running for now 20, 35 years, and doing fairly well, except for the problems with coral bleaching. A little bit not even thought about when the original plans were constructed. The European Union has a maritime spatial planning directive. Directive, for those of you not from Europe, is a law. It's legislation, and it requires the countries of the EU, member countries that have marine waters, to construct a maritime spatial plan by 2021. Okay? So that's 23 countries, more or less, that will have that plan in around 2020. And in fact, this spike where we start accelerating here is the fact that the EU is going to have that requirement, and there will be many plans that are put in place around that period of time. Okay? So this is the graph of the coverage by different plans for countries that have actually produced a maritime plan. Right now we have about 15 countries, somewhere in here. This is about where we are now. And this is what we expect to have by the year 2030, which is a good planning period. But about half of the world's exclusive economic zones will be under government-approved maritime spatial plans. Not academic plans, not plans developed by an NGO, but by government, so that there will be some official nature of the plan, and there will be some enforceability that's possible under those kinds of plans. So, challenges for the future. Well, we could go on. This could be a long, I could talk for hours on challenges for the future. But here are some obvious ones. Okay? Marine spatial plans, like many other plans, are being developed somewhat independent of other planning activities in various regions. Okay? So we're saying we should be integrated, and many of them are integrated within the plan, but they're not integrated with land use plans on terrestrial areas. They're not integrated with economic development plans. And so the idea of trying to expand the interactions among all these different kinds of planning activities is very important. That's the first one. We want to make sure that water quality plans are consistent with the maritime plans, for example. Mike Elliott mentioned the Marine Framework Directive, Marine Strategy Framework Directive has to be integrated with the Marine Spatial Planning and Maritime Spatial Planning Directive. It's not now. They're working on it, but it's not. Moving to a blue economy. Blue economy is an interesting slogan. Okay? And I characterize it as a slogan because we're not quite sure what the blue economy is almost anywhere. Politicians love the idea because they can talk about increased jobs, increased GDP, better employment numbers. Okay? All kinds of things that are being claimed for the blue economy. But again, no one has really developed a plan for the blue economy yet. There are some countries that are further along than others in thinking about the blue economy. But until I begin to see something that looks like a plan or looks like goals and objectives, so that we can make sure that not only are we talking about economic development, even if it is, quote, sustainable, we have something in those plans that also says we've got to maintain the ecosystem services that we know are in those areas as well. So when we get to that point, I think we have blue economy plans, but we're not there yet. It's a little bit like the ecosystem approach. It's easy to talk about these things. I've written academic articles about these kinds of things. Some of you may have done the same kind of thing. Doing it is a lot different than writing about it or talking about it. So actually putting together these kinds of plans to produce those kinds of outcomes is the real challenge that we have with respect to the blue economy. Yep, I'm down to 2 minutes. The future into marine spatial planning, I already mentioned that many plans don't go into the future, right? They just talk about where we are today, and they say, we've got an incredible database, you can come to our data portal, you can make decisions about permits, you can do things today, but that's not doing things into the future. So we want to have plans that work on the future. Implementation, okay? Can we use other kinds of incentives to implement marine spatial plannings other than zoning, which is a regulatory tool? Are economic incentives possible? User charges possible? All these kinds of things that exist outside of just strictly regulatory tools, and zoning in particular, need to be examined in terms of expanding the kinds of incentives that can be used. Monitoring and evaluation, I've already mentioned that. We talk about doing adaptive management. Everybody talks about that. Nobody, not nobody, but very few people actually focus on the need for monitoring and evaluation of the performance of plans in order to have effective marine spatial planning. Transboundary MSP, that's important. That's something that the European Union is very enthused about right now. Most plans have been developed at the national level, not much across borders. And there are conflicts even in plans, for example, between Belgium and the Netherlands, where there's sand and gravel on one side and a protected area on the other side of the border. Marine spatial planning in the Arctic Ocean, this is one that's screaming for application of maritime planning, but nobody's doing it yet. There are plans for Norway, there are plans in Canada, there are good data for many of these areas. Nobody's thinking about doing a pan-Arctic kind of marine plan. And then finally, the last frontier with respect to marine space is the high seas. And we're just beginning to recognize that maritime spatial planning would also be possible in the high seas. A little tricky with respect to who would do it, but it certainly is possible. I'll just close with this website. The URL is at the bottom there. If you're interested in maritime spatial planning and what's going on in terms of the status of these 65 countries that are already doing planning, some information in terms of how it actually can be done. The IOC has a manual on a guide to maritime spatial planning that is on this website and has been updated since 2009 with better examples. And with that, I'm done. Thank you. Interesting technology on the last slide. If you notice, that's not a diver on the right side, that's a robot.
All right, thanks very much indeed, Chuck. That sets the scene nicely. Other questions from the audience then, please?
Provided a very nice outlook at, or I'd say an overview of what is happening in the world as regards spatial planning in marine protected areas. So that was really nice information to receive. Thank you very much. I was wondering, when you mentioned the last frontier as the high seas, and that marine spatial planning are in fact needed, and possibly also policing those plans is also needed. I'm wondering if you encompass the seabed in the high seas, or would that be only a surface measure, with that not meaning superficial at all? However, I just wanted to remind that there was an article that was published recently by Professor Danilaro and colleagues on possibly creating a moratorium on the seabeds of the seas in areas which may be subject to exploitation before we can understand what's in there. Thank you very much.
Well, there are a number of questions within your question, I think. One thing, you mentioned policing and enforcement in the high seas. It's getting easier. In fact, there's some really good examples recently of illegal fishing, particularly in the Galapagos, if you read the Science News, where a fairly large mothership of Chinese mothership was taking on sharks and shark fins, and they were caught right in the middle of the Galapagos Marine Reserve, which is also a Marine World Heritage Site. So that's not good. And fortunately, the park and the Ecuadorian Navy chased this vessel down. They caught it with, I think, 5.5 million tons or some ridiculous number of sharks and fins. And they were able to analyze where that vessel had been going over the last several months by using AIS, automated something system, information system, I guess, that is reporting the position of ships at sea, largely for navigation and collision reasons. But they were able to track where that vessel had been. And not only where it had been, but what it was doing when it was underway. Because if the vessel stopped and there are lots of other little small ships around it, they're probably offloading cargo onto that mothership. They were, when I said 5.5 million, it was $5.5 million, I believe, was the fine that's been put on that onto China and the owner of the vessel, and the whole crew, including the captain, are in prison right now, probably to be released relatively soon. But at least the possibility of doing this kind of tracking is there's something called Global Fishing Watch, and that's the overall program that does this kind of work. So enforcement on the high seas has gotten a lot better, largely because of technological advances and monitoring, satellite monitoring, AIS reporting, other kinds of things. So I don't think that's such a big issue. It used to be, how are we going to enforce these large marine protected areas, or how are we going to enforce anything on the high seas? I think we're getting there, and it's advancing extremely quickly. You asked about the area, the surface, and the bottom and the surface. Of course, if you're doing marine planning, you're going to be interested in all dimensions, all 4 dimensions, right? 3 dimensions in space and time as well, because things are moving around. Critters are moving around in that space, so you want to have a spatial dimension to your plans as well. Again, this is easy to say. It's difficult to put it in place, but that's certainly where we would go, would be to include everything if we were doing high seas. I don't think it's a science or technology issue as much as it is a political issue, okay? And that gets back all the way to marine or maritime spatial planning. The biggest problem we have is not more data, not more science, maybe not even more money. It's the political will to do this, to commit to doing planning, and to get political leaders to say this is a good idea, this is good for the future, it's good for our nation, and we're going to do it. That has happened, right? There are examples of political leaders who are out there who are doing it. There are also a lot of political leaders who sit on their hands and say, I'm going to be gone in a couple of years, and we're talking about problems that are 20 years from now and solutions that are 20 years. I'm not going to get any credit for that, and they could care less about it. So I think the real problem is not so much in the natural sciences or technology or even planning. It's getting the political will, the buy-in by politicians and leaders of various kinds to actually push the idea that we should be planning for the future and not just letting things happen. We love to let things happen, and it's awfully costly sometimes to let things happen. And they can be avoided by good planning.
Okay, thank you very much. Time is on, and so we'll move to our next speaker. Really.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm speaking on behalf of Fabio Trincardi, who cannot be here, so I was told yesterday that I had to give this presentation. It's nice to follow the previous one because there are some answers also from a scientific point of view. Science is still needed. We don't know everything, and doing politics without knowing things can lead to unwise management or mismanagement. So this is the outline of the talk. What are the uses of the sea floor? Well, it's not only the sea floor, it's the sea. Fabio Trincardi is a geologist, so he sees the floor only, but I see also the water column. And so there is exploitation of goods, and they have a price. It's an area of waste disposal, interface for further exploitation, and there is a substantial difference anyway between the sea floor and the rest of the sea. The sea floor is two-dimensional, the water column is three-dimensional. And then there is time. We are terrestrial animals, so we always think about areas, marine protected areas, but it's not areas, it's volumes. So we have to change our way of framing the phase that we want to manage. On land we have areas, in the sea we have volumes. And maps usually describe patterns. We need to know also the processes that lead to these patterns. And so the maritime, or marine, I prefer marine. Maritime means that you put the man into the thing. Marine is only for marine protected area and so on. So we need to consider also the processes, and the maps we have are usually based on patterns and not on both patterns and processes. Of course, we start from a series of false assumptions, like marine resources are not limited. They are, but our economists want the GDP to grow indefinitely. If it stops growing, it's stagnation. If it goes down, it's recession. So they think of the world as an unlimited entity. It is not. So the premises, the theoretical premises of the prevailing economic dogmas are simply wrong. There is a limit. Insignificance of human impacts, this is wrong too. We know that it's not true. And the submarine landscape is not static. It changes. And so we have to cope with change. Why we need maritime spatial planning? We have seen it in depth in these talks, so I will not go much more in detail through it to outline the importance of this process. And we cite LL down there, okay? So we heard about it already. The principles are ecosystem-based. Again, ecosystem-based implies that we know how the ecosystems are made, patterns, and how they work, processes. Most of the times, we don't know. So we claim that it's ecosystem-based, but then it is not. Integrated across sectors and agencies, and this is the orandogram of Mike Elliott that we saw before. It has to be area-based. It's wrong. It has to be volume-based, not area-based. It has to be adaptive, so we have to cope with change and change our practices in time. And it has to be strategic, anticipatory, preparatory. These are the buzzwords that you find in all presentations. I will give an example of what we have done in the Mediterranean for integrating these things. And this has been done with the use of Marxan, which is an algorithm that has been set up in Australia by Hugh Possingham just to do maritime spatial planning or marine spatial planning. You need to take all the information about the environment. Here, unfortunately, there is only the benthic environment because the Habitats Directive, for the Habitats Directive in Europe, the environment is an area, and they are all benthic, the habitats of the directive, and then there are the pressures. And then you have to find compromises between the natural environment and the human environment and decide where to put the no-take zones. In order to do that and to give advice to the politicians, you need sound science. If you don't have that, you cannot plan properly. Here there is a framework for maritime spatial planning. We have seen that in previous presentations, so I will not tell the same things over and over again. And again, there is a lot of things that we have to do. In the previous presentation we saw them also in Mike Elliott's presentation, so I will not go in very detail. In the Mediterranean, tourism is extremely important. Our income increases in the months when millions of people come to the Mediterranean, and the natural environment is a very important asset for our economy. And so all these sectors deal directly or indirectly with the seafloor and the water column. In the original talk, it was the seafloor, but I put the water column too. This is an example of marine spatial planning in Italy and the economic zones in the Mediterranean and so on. Of course, the political borders have absolutely no ecological meaning, and so we have to cope with these problems, and we have to find international agreements. It's useless to manage properly your exclusive economic zone if the others in front of you are destroying everything. Then the destruction will come also to you. So we need wise politicians who can speak to each other. There are lots of ministries, and this goes back to the orandogram of Mike Elliott. This is the pyramid of knowledge, data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. There is also truth. Is this true when we find these things? Maybe we based our wisdom on something that is not true. And there are lots of examples in this direction. So the data are very important, the information is very important, but then it has to be translated into knowledge. We have huge databases. We have invested in technology to take this data, to store them, and there are less and less people who know how to use this data. So it's useless to continue to accumulate data without having scientists who can take care of them and provide knowledge so that the wisdom of the politicians will be really wisdomatic and not based on ill knowledge. Here again, some research topics. There are very many, and land-sea interactions are very important. Now we are all speaking about plastic, and we want to remove plastic. The problem of plastic will be solved by not producing plastic anymore. The plastic will deposit on the sea bottom. There will be a little stratum of plastic that will remember this era, and then it's finished. We have to stop throwing plastic in the environment, and this is land-based. And all the other things are, of course, important. We have to map the habitats. And here you have the beautiful techniques we have to map the habitats, but these are only benthic habitats. The Habitats Directive of the European Union has a terrestrial bias. It speaks only about surfaces. The most widespread habitat of the planet is the water column, and it's a habitat, and it's not homogeneous. And so the processes take place there. So we have to map that too. We can find beautiful things like these white corals in the Mediterranean. This is the dynamics of the Mediterranean Sea. The Mediterranean Sea is closed basin, and it's paradigmatic because it works like the world ocean. You will see in another slide. But here you can see the main water movements, the horizontal water movements that take place into the Mediterranean. You see lots of gyres. And these gyres determine processes that are different in the different sections. So these are places where ecosystem processes go in at different speeds and with different and determining different patterns. Also what is on the sea floor. So we cannot understand the sea floor if we don't understand the water column. This is the way the Mediterranean works. It's more, the salinity is higher than in the Atlantic, and so there is a current that enters the Mediterranean from the surface, and there is another current that goes out. The intermediate Levantine current flows out at 500 meters. This renews the waters of the Mediterranean. But below 500 meters, there is no water renewal. This is possible because there are the cold engines. One is here, the other one is there. They are like the poles for us. Okay, the cold water there sinks. It goes down and brings oxygen to the deep sea. And then there are upwellings offshore. If you don't understand that, you cannot manage the system properly. And it doesn't know any barrier. The white corals that you saw are here, but they are present because the cold engine from the North Adriatic brings water there through cascading phenomena. So the pattern is there are the white corals. The process is there is the cold engine up here. Without the cold engine, the white corals will not survive. And then there are gyres determined by the presence of capes and so on. The cascading here of the cold engines go through canyons, and so it goes down. But if there is no cascading, the canyons form upwellings. And so they connect the deep sea with the coastal systems. All these things are connected. And all these processes generate the patterns that we see in the marine systems. Here there are some instances on how the information is collected, is assembled, and then decisions are taken how to manage it. This is I live here. Lecce. And we had lots of projects around here. One that was very complex was Coconut on the design of marine protected areas in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. But then we realized that it's vain to think only about not marine protected areas, networks of marine protected areas, which is different. So you want to protect also the space in between the marine protected areas. And we found lots of things. Okay, these are, and I will tell you the outcome of this project right now. This is too complex, and so we jump it. These are the cumulative impacts on ecosystems. Of course, we know the impacts, but we have to know also the properties of the systems that are impacted, and very often we don't know. And these are several examples on how to map the sea bottom, mainly, in order to take decisions. There are impacts that cannot be predicted, and we have to be aware of that too, and try to design scenarios that take care of these uncertainties. The future is very difficult to be predicted, for a simple reason: the future doesn't exist. And it will exist, it will not be the future anymore. So we don't have the crystal ball, but we can infer about the possibilities of future events. This is BlueMed, which is an initiative in the Mediterranean. I go very far, very fast. I am at the very end. This is our approach in Coconut. We have fine-scale resolution maps of all the patterns and processes, including human activities, that take place in the environment. and then we put them together and we look at the interactions with Marxan in order to plan actions so as to have the least conflict among the different stakeholders. The basic concept is cells of ecosystem functioning, because we don't have special units for doing the management. The cells of ecosystem functioning are a concept that was developed by this project, and it's based on connectivity. Connectivity connects things and determines the patterns through the processes. We need to link the two things, and we need to map these units of management. Once we know what is the frame, the spatial frame and the temporal frame for planning our actions, then we can do wise spatial planning. In my opinion, the future is to map the cells of ecosystem functioning, understand how they work, what are their patterns and the processes that lead to them. They are connected, of course, and this is based on connectivity, and this is a contribution that science can give to politicians in order to take wise decisions. Thank you. 16 minutes, I'm sorry.
Wonderful timing, it's almost as wonderful as that terrific holistic view you've given us of
Holistic is a buzzword that is always present in all the documents. Holistic, integrative, ecosystem-based, cross-cutting. In this project, I have 39 institutes. We were studying connectivity, and we studied it in 4 ways, with genetics, physical oceanography, patterns of biodiversity on the sea bottom, and propagules in the water column. The 4 groups never spoke to each other. They never spoke to each other. We had a synthetic workshop at the end, and I had to take them and to put them together in order to try to be holistic. So science is resisting to holistic things. Each one of us is convinced that his own approach is the best. Scientists, yes, the scientific community is resisting. So the European Union is asking us to be holistic, and we want to be reductionistic. And we split the things in pieces, and each one of us is praising for his own approach. And so the problem is internal to the scientific community. We have to go to make a quantum leap in this direction. This is more or less a timid example on how to do it. With this concept of cells of ecosystem functioning. If you find a better one, it's okay. By now, I think it's the only available one that puts things together to such an extent.
Okay, we'll add the term interconnected holisticity then to our
Bravo. Holistic holisticity.
Thanks very much. So, question please.
No questions. Okay.
Okay, well, I got a nice suggestion. Speaking of questions for afterwards, maybe we have a little bit of time. Yes, thank you very much indeed. Okay, thank you very much. So the knowledge diagram we just saw there had as its base data, and this is an issue we're picking up now with Anthony, who will be walking us through some of the problems here with data gaps and some of the innovations that are required to actually start to fill the gaps.
So it's actually the next talk after this one. This one isn't being given.
Yes.
Right. Oh, you
So
need,
can we tell them
we
inside
haven't got the right, we haven't got the right one.
section? In fact, I would have liked to have heard this talk, but it's a pity he's not actually coming. But there we go.
We had actually 4 speakers around for the reading, and the one you just saw there from Bahrain, from Integrale Ocean, was unable to join us. He was drowned by the strike in Paris and fell victim to that at believe having to hang around for about 8 hours waiting to change planes and that course did not work. So we had to his plans to join us for last moment.
Okay, so thank you everybody. I'd like to thank Anita and Roberto for giving me the opportunity to come and talk to you. I'm from the National University of Ireland in Galway, but I'm representing the Atlas project, which is a new H2020 project that's just kicked off. It's a very ambitious project. It's looking to develop the science basis for marine spatial planning at the level of the North Atlantic Basin. And what I'll do in my talk is just give you a very brief introduction to what Atlas is about. I was told that I was the last talk in this session, so I should be fairly brief. And then I'll give you a couple of examples of how we've been trying to address the lack of data in the deep sea and the offshore from a previous project that I worked in called Coralfish. So I guess this slide sums up a lot of what Chuck was talking about earlier on, the problem with a sectoral approach to management. Eventually it doesn't work. So the kind of wisdom at the moment is that we need to move to, and I'll use some of these buzzwords that Nando doesn't like, a holistic ecosystem-based management approach. And I guess that MSP is probably the first time that we've had a tool, decision to support tool, that can actually support the implementation of ecosystem-based management to some degree, because MSP provides the means to actually integrate all the area-based management measures in all the different instruments that are out there in one common framework. Another driver for the Atlas project that I'm involved in is this ongoing push to develop a global instrument to protect biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So there have been a series of preparatory committee meetings. The last of them was held in New York in June. And a recommendation has gone through from the preparatory meeting to the United Nations General Assembly that they should go ahead and produce a regulation to protect biodiversity in the high seas and the areas beyond national jurisdiction. So what should happen next is, once that's ratified, that there should be an intergovernmental conference. And you can just see on top there's some of the members of Atlas who had side meetings or side events as part of the PrepCom, so they could inform delegates about some of the pressing scientific issues. And I'm sure that Atlas will also contribute to the Intergovernmental Conference when it occurs. So how did Atlas come across? Well, obviously with the economic crash in the last decade, Europe, in common with a lot of other countries, started to look to oceans and seas as perhaps an area where we could actually develop economic growth. So the Commission produced a call called Unlocking the Potential of Seas and Oceans, and there was a specific topic, improving the preservation and sustainable exploitation of Atlantic marine ecosystems. And I'm happy to say that the Atlas Consortium was one of two successful projects. The other one was called Sponges. Kicked off last year. We've got 24 partners from about 12 different countries. It's very fieldwork orientated, so there are at least 25 deep sea cruises planned to gather new data to better understand the functioning of ecosystems in the Atlantic, and we're adding new cruises all the time. In common with a lot of these large-scale projects, it's very multidisciplinary, so you have the full range of natural science, but also social scientists, so we've got economists and legal experts, and even communication experts in the consortium. We're looking at vulnerable marine ecosystems in the Atlantic, so particularly focusing on cold-water corals, on sponges, and on hydrothermal vent areas. And basically what we're trying to do is get new information to better understand the functioning of the ecosystems. We want to also understand how these ecosystems may respond to climate change. So we've got a major effort looking at physical oceanography. So I think Nando will be glad to know that we're actually taking the water column into account. And the idea is that this work should lead to stimulating blue growth while making sure that we conserve important habitats and ecosystems in the Atlantic. So as well as taking a whole Atlantic approach, we have a number of well-chosen case studies in different jurisdictions, so within European EEZ, in areas beyond national jurisdiction, and also in the US and Canada. And they represent a full range of different ecosystems and blue growth sectors as well. So in terms of developing tools and methods to support marine spatial planning in an area where there's very little data in actual fact, what can we do? Well, I suppose the first thing is to ask the question, how can we protect vulnerable marine ecosystems from human pressures while minimizing conflicts with industry? And how do we reconcile demands from different stakeholders on how to use the deep sea? So I'll just give you one example from the Coralfish project. And this was work that was done off Iceland. This is the continental shelf break. And you can just see this is a fishing activity mapped along here. And then the blue areas are proposed marine protected area network to protect vulnerable marine ecosystems, particular corals. So moving on, you can see that the initial attempt by the authorities to protect corals was this red box here. And when you actually map that onto the fishing activity, you can see that the eastern boundary was right in the middle of one of the most intensely fished zones. So the authorities went back to the fishermen and started a dialogue. And basically the fishermen were able to give them the information that this is where most of the fishing took place. The authorities went back and then redesigned their MPA so that the conservation concerns were actually taken into account, but they were able to move away from the area that was most fished. So it was a win-win situation by creating the dialogue with industry. So I think it's a pretty good example. Another big issue, as I say, we're data limited in the deep sea, so to comply with the various legislation out there, we need to know where VMEs occur. So what we've relied on in the past is just point source data, so samples that were taken with various sampling devices, box cores, information coming up from fishing nets, bycatching fishing nets, and more recently we have transects using tow camera systems or ROVs and so on and so forth. But even so, even with all this effort, we're still only actually getting actual data from very small areas in the whole of the ocean. So what can we do? So this is an example from one of our coralfish colleagues from Ifremer, basically linking coral occurrence to geomorphological proxies, which are based on high-resolution multi-beam bathymetry. So one of the big innovations, and I think Nando touched on this briefly, in the last 15 or 20 years has been the development of multi-beam echo sounding technology, which allows 100% coverage of the seafloor in terms of generating bathymetry. Up until that became mainstream, we were still relying on just lead and line points and extrapolating over very large areas, so we didn't really know a whole lot about the deep sea floor. An example, Ireland was one of the first countries in the world, in actual fact, to undertake a full multi-beam mapping exercise of its EEZ. And within 3 years, it was able to map 600,000 square kilometers to very high resolution. And that just opened up a whole new avenue of research. We identified things that we had no idea were there before. So this is multi-beam mapping in canyon systems in the Bay of Biscay. And what you can do is when you have this detailed information, you can actually classify it using various algorithms in GIS, and you can extract a lot of these morphological geoforms. And the idea then is that for certain particular vulnerable marine ecosystems, you can try and identify which of those classes are most likely to contain those particular species or habitats of interest. So this just shows you we were looking for coral reefs and so on and so forth, and we identified various proxies. We actually used these detailed maps in cruises when we had some extra time to go and look for new areas where we thought there might be coral. and the maps actually proved very valuable to do that. So we went straight to new areas that we'd never been to before, where we predicted we'd find corals based on this system, and we found corals. So that was very interesting. Another method that's been used a lot in the last few years is habitat suitability modeling. And basically, as I showed you in the earlier slide of points information, we have detailed information about the location of species and habitats in certain areas. What we do is we model the habitat suitability based on all of environmental data that we can obtain. And then we can use that same environmental data to actually extrapolate out into much larger areas where we expect to find corals. So a couple of examples. We've done this from global to local scale. So this is an example of work that was done to predict the likely occurrence of black corals globally. And you can just see how it can be used. These are green areas, which are marine protected areas globally. And what you can do then is compare how well marine protected area networks are actually conserving these particular species or ecosystems. So you can see there's a lot of blue here without any green. So in fact, the world network of MPAs is not doing a particularly good job in protecting these particular type of corals. We've also done that more locally. We've mapped the predicted likely occurrence of cold-water coral reef, Lophelia reefs in Irish waters. The little red patches here are actually known occurrence. And we've run our models, and you can see the orange colors here are where we predict coral is likely to be found. And what we've done then is we've compared it to existing conservation measures. So these boxes are 4 special areas of conservation under the Habitats Directive, which cover about 3,500 square kilometers. But what you see is that they're all clustered together in the center of the likely range of coral habitat found in Irish waters. So what we suggested was that to really conserve the full range, biogeographic range of corals in Irish waters, you needed to look to the north, to the south, and to the west. And in actual fact, in the last year, the competent authority in Ireland has actually run a cruise and has started to look up here and down here because it wants to designate additional areas to address these gaps. So that's a useful mechanism as well. Another thing you can do, we heard earlier on about risk assessment. You can use this type of approach to carry out risk assessment. So we did some work with Andy Kenny in CFAS, and he proposed a seabed risk categorization. So using both the known presence of target VMEs, but also the model presence as well, the predicted presence of VMEs. And then what you do is you overlap whatever the impacting activity is. In the case that we used, it was fishing activity. And then you can assign a risk category from high to moderate to low. And then based on that, you can come up with a whole suite of potential management measures. And this just shows you the map again of known VMEs and our predicted potential distribution of corals. And also what's important is where corals aren't found. So we've built our models on the back of terrain analysis of the high-resolution multi-beam data that Ireland has. So these are probably the most accurate habitat suitability models for corals that you can get anywhere. So it means that areas where we say there are likely to be no coral are probably quite accurate and can be used for planning purposes as well. So this is fishing activity binned into 10-kilometer boxes, and then we overlay the two, and then we consign our risk activities based on the degree of overlap and the degree of vulnerability. So you can see there, it already brings you into a sort of a marine spatial planning scenario, and obviously you can repeat this for other sectors as well. So at that point, I think I'll just stop there and just go on and throw up a couple of slides for the discussion, perhaps, food for thought. I'm in the Mercies project with Roberto, and one of the things that has impressed me in the last couple of years is having discussions about natural capital and natural capital accounting. So countries are starting to do this generally, to look at all their natural resources. Some large companies are starting to include natural capital accounting on their balance sheets. And the other thing that's linked to that, well, first of all, it's the idea that you have a finite resource, and Nando mentioned that. There's this concept of no net loss, which DG Environment in Europe put a bit of work into about 2-3 years ago, trying to survey what industry thought about the concept of no net loss. And that feeds into this mitigation hierarchy. So obviously, if at all possible, you should avoid any damage to the seafloor or to the area that you're working in. But if damage is unavoidable, then you're into the territory of looking at biodiversity offsets. So perhaps you can invest money on restoring biodiversity in other areas, or making sure that at least you restore the area that you've worked in back to something that's ecologically functioning. And finally, I'll just leave you with this slide. This is something I came across when I was preparing this talk. Personally, I'd never heard of the word cadastre before. So I put the definition up there because I'm sure one or two of you haven't heard of it either. So a marine cadastre is a system to enable the boundaries of maritime rights and interests to be recorded, spatially managed and physically defined in relationship to the boundaries of other neighbouring or underlying rights and interests. And then linked to that, you have the idea of a sea cadastre parcel, which is defined as the volumetric reality of every distinct marine zone, with the rights and charges on the UNCLOS, and the patrimonial rights, which include rights in REM. My simple understanding of that is that if you've had a historical activity in an area, then that means you've got some sort of historical rights to the area, which is actually a big problem for marine spatial planning. If you're trying to put a new activity into an area, you're actually running up against the uses that have already been there for a long time. And then the fourth dimension is the temporary nature, and this was mentioned by Chuck and others, the temporary nature of the marine area. And also, in fact, of applying rights. So, some activities only need to have access to an area for a limited time, whereas others, if you're putting in complicated marine subsea structures, want to have some certainty over longer periods of time. So I guess what this is actually getting at a little bit is what form of property rights do we need to have to deliver marine spatial planning? And you're looking at things like leasing. Somebody mentioned early on about, well, it was Chuck actually, that China already have this tax on use. So that was a good example to bring. And I guess that because this report is quite new in Europe, that this is something that's going to be a focus of attention for the next while. So I think it's quite an interesting area for further discussion, particularly for OECD. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any questions? Yes, we do. We have a microphone back there.
Thank you. I think it's a question for Fernando, in the room. I like the concept of thinking about the column of the water in relation to the seabed, but I was actually wondering what sort of difference it actually meant, given the column is not fixed, it's fluid and moving in all sorts of directions. And in my view, all that does is it probably just expands the area of seabed of interest. So we are still going to be thinking about the seabed, but what the column does is it changes the scope of the seabed that we are looking at. Is that how you would look at it? I should confess I'm not a marine specialist, but I've just been wondering since you made an interesting observation.
The sea connects things. So if you have those Lophelia beds there, it's a pattern of distribution. If you go in the Mediterranean, the Lophelia, which is here, depends on the cold engine that is up there. And the process of the water that flows and brings the nutrients to Lophelia makes it possible for Lophelia to be there. So one thing is to know where it is, another thing is to know what are the processes that allow it to be there, because things move. So if we want to map this thing, Lophelia is not only there, it's also where the processes that allow for its existence take place. And if you want to manage it, you cannot manage just that place. You have to manage also the others. Otherwise, you will not do it properly. And in the Mediterranean, for instance, there has been the Eastern Mediterranean Transit, which means that the cold engine of the Northern Adriatic stopped. It's called cold engine, and we are in a period of global warming. So these things can happen. You can see your Lophelia dying because something else happened in another place. It's not due to mismanagement of the place. It's the processes that determine the pattern. So we need to understand these things because it's fluid. Everything is connected in the sea. But there are anyway boundaries. So there are gyres, there are fronts, and all these things. These are studied by physical oceanographers. But then they have to be put together with the patterns that we see. Once we do this, we can understand better and manage better the marine environment. The concept of the cells of ecosystem functioning are units of functioning of ecosystems that put together patterns and processes that are compact enough to be managed. And this is a challenge to understand how these systems work. We have all the pieces of knowledge for these things. We have just to put them together and to speak to each other. And it's not happening yet. When it will happen, we'll have holistic approaches.
Yeah, can I add to that as well?
Yes.
In the Atlas project, one of the things that we've been doing, we're trying to look at connectivity in terms of marine protected area networks. So we're putting an effort into both looking at gene flow, but also into modeling larval dispersion. So what we found is that in the Atlantic you've got various oceanographic processes. So one is called the North Atlantic Oscillation that can be in a positive phase or a negative phase. So it's a bit like an El Nino, but a different type of process. And when you run the larval dispersion models, you find that the larvae go in different directions depending on whether this is in a positive or a negative phase. So if you don't understand the physical oceanographic processes, then you haven't got a chance of planning for your marine protected area networks. Okay?
And larvae are not inertial particles.
No.
They are different for every species. In the models, they are inertial particles, usually.
Well, yeah, but in the modern, in the latest models, they're starting to put in larval behavior as well. And that does, you're right, it changes the distribution of where they go, yeah. Sure. But that's an area for further work, of course. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for the change. We have another question.
Thank you. David Bennett from DeepSea's Environmental Solutions in the UK. You've done a wonderful job in the last 20 years in protecting corals and our sponges as vulnerable marine ecosystems. And one of the problems with that is that probably all deep sea organisms are vulnerable because of their life history characteristics. And therefore I wonder, by producing maps that just focus on one or two taxa, are we doing a disservice and maybe mismanaging the vast majority of other phyla in the oceans because we're ignoring them?
And Anthony, can I just tie on it? A similar question that's been in my own mind as well. Because the examples you say are sort of win-win solutions, but it's perfectly conceivable, I suppose, that such technologies can lead to the identification of presence of certain species, fish, for example, which would then be perhaps overfishing and therefore suboptimal outcomes. Maybe because I think we're on the same line here of questioning.
Well, there are two questions there. One, in terms of vulnerable marine ecosystems, I guess you have to start somewhere. So obviously, you start with the most charismatic species. But the thing to remember is when you, like I showed an example of 4 special areas of conservation off the west coast of Ireland, covering 3,500 kilometres, the amount of coral in those coral boxes is probably 5% in terms of area coverage. So that means there's a lot of other habitat ecosystem components being actually protected as well as corals. So that's one answer. So, you know, it's not just a question that you very tightly conserve a particular patch of corals. You actually usually have a buffer zone and so on and so forth. So you're actually pulling in a lot of other things that mightn't be as charismatic, like areas of sand or mud and so on. In relation to your question, yeah, that is a huge issue in the sense that technology has advanced so far now that you can basically find every fish in the sea without a problem. So the first time that detailed seafloor maps were used was, there was an example from Browns Bank off Canada, where industry actually worked with the Canadian Geological Survey to go out and map an area that they were, I think it was beam trawling for, I forget the species, but because they had detailed maps, it meant that the fishermen were able to go out with less robust, less heavy gear. They saved money in terms of the amount of fuel that they needed to go out to get their catches. And then you were actually able to plan. They weren't losing gear in unsuitable areas and so forth. But that means that, you know, then you actually do need robust marine spatial planning to actually zone the activity into an area where you have the detailed maps. So there are calls around the world now that we need to map our oceans. So there is a challenge to map the entire seafloor of the ocean by 2030. Not sure if it's going to happen, but certainly we have the technology. If the political will is there to do it, we can do it.
Okay. Time for one more question before we break for lunch. No, I can see very hungry faces around the room. So I'm not going to get in the way of mass exodus to the buffet. So thank you very much indeed,
Okay.
Anthony, and please a big hand to all the three speakers.